Now let's turn to a closer look, which is the big story of the week, pretty much for everybody, everywhere around the world. And that is the shocking news that Donald Trump has been reelected as president of the United States. At least that's how it appears this morning. The election was last night, after all, so probably too close to say anything for certain, but it seems pretty likely. Also, it seems pretty likely that the US Senate is going to swing into Republican hands, and there are early indications that the House the House of Representatives may also end up being dominated by the Republicans, at least by a slim margin. If that happens, this could really change a lot of aspects of American life and American policy. Certainly, there are many, many things that we could talk about, but this is the Gestalt IT rundown. We talk about enterprise technology here, so let's try to focus on that aspect. What are the implications to enterprise technology of another Trump presidency? Well, it's kind of hard to know because Donald Trump and the Republican Party have not actually been all that clear in their policy platform or their initiatives that they would take if they retook the White House. In fact, this has been one of the challenges for the media dealing with Donald Trump generally, because he tends to say a lot of things, and then people try to interpret those things into concrete policy, and then sometimes he'll say something that conflicts with that. And we're going to see that that's the case with a lot of these enterprise tech aspects of policy as well. But let's start off, Jack, just with your impression. If assuming that Trump returns as president and that the Republicans return to control at least of the Senate, if not the House, what does this mean for enterprise technology?
Well, I think for me, the way I look at it is there's sort of two big implications. The first is that Trump is a very big deregulator. And I can't remember what he did in his first term, but he has publicly stated that in his second term, he wants to eliminate 10 regulations for every new regulation, which really means that it's hard to get new regulations in place that will regulate big tech. And so I think that's going to be one area where there's going to be, there has been over the past 4 years, a big drive for regulation. And I think we'll see that tail down. And in fact, we may see some of the regulation pop off. The other area where I think Donald Trump is looks at the world a little bit differently than the outgoing administration would be in the area of mergers and acquisitions, and I think there was the current administration was less enthusiastic about M&A activity, and now I think we may see some more big acquisitions, big M&A activity, where it might have in the past been considered anti-competitive or buying your competitors out. We may see that activity more now with Trump in office.
Yeah, those are certainly things I think that we can kind of infer from the general line of statements that he says. But again, that's sort of how we have to approach this, because he's not big on written policy documents and that sort of thing. So what else can we infer? Well, one of the big questions that came up earlier in the show is nuclear energy. So certainly Trump has talked a lot about nuclear energy in the past. And in fact, one of the platform planks from the RNC convention was a commitment to unleash energy production from all sources, including nuclear. But in very typical Trump fashion, when people tried to pin him down on this, specifically some guy named Joe Rogan, who apparently has a podcast, asked Trump about nuclear energy, and Trump's response was actually not all that positive on it. In fact, he immediately jumped to the fact that nuclear energy is complex and expensive and dangerous, essentially undermining the platform plank of the Republican Party to some extent. But interestingly, he did mention small modular reactors in that answer, which means that clearly, internally, they've been talking about this whole idea about building small modular nuclear reactors that are deployed at individual factories or data centers. That's been one of the topics that has been brought up by many of the hyperscalers as a way to power their AI infrastructure, as opposed to, for example, locating it next to an existing nuclear power plant or even building a new big nuclear power plant. The problem with SMR is, number one, they don't exist. This is a technology that is more theoretical than realistic. Also, the ones that have been planned don't look all that cost competitive. And in fact, ultimately, I think that companies may turn away from the whole SMR idea based solely on finance. But that being said, Trump does seem to have a pro nuclear stance generally, if he seems to be pretty concerned about the safety overall. The other aspect that's interesting to me is AI. Now, there was an interesting report last week which showed that AI is really not a consideration for most of the folks in Trump's coalition. If you talk to people about concerns about AI safety and privacy and implications for democracy and things like that, well, that tends to be, in the US at least, a very left wing issue. And if you talk about those, if you bring those up in polling of Trump voters, they tend to dismiss that entire line of questioning outright. They're not all that worried about AI. They're not all that interested in AI. And I found it really remarkable that that wasn't a topic that came up at all in the election this year. At least wasn't a major topic if it came up at all. So I think what we're going to see is probably a much more laissez-faire attitude toward AI and regulations around privacy of data and the use of AI to displace jobs and so on. That's also probably the case when you look at the people who are advising Trump. I mean, his new BFF, Elon Musk, is building one of the largest AI supercomputers in the world, as we've talked about here on the rundown. Uh, Elon is certainly not going to try to talk Trump into regulating AI. The same is true of some of the other financiers and Silicon Valley VCs that have rallied behind Trump's plans. And if you look at their belief system in terms of where they believe the world and society needs to go in this sort of transhumanist direction, most of them believe that AI is part of the inevitable process of technology. So I suspect that Trump probably doesn't know a lot about AI. This is a guy, remember, who doesn't even use a computer. But it is likely that all the people around him are talking about it pretty favorably. And that's likely to mean a lot less regulation and a lot more investment in AI. I guess the other thing that we could think about too is, what about the rest of the world of tech? Jack, what do you think about how this all, what does this all mean for big tech investments?
Well, I think the where the investments go may change over the next couple of years. I would not be surprised if the Trump administration starts investing more in military technology and military capabilities, and so I think defense or defense-related technology will start to see an interest in an increased investment. And I think you might also see some interesting collaboration with the Israeli tech VC environment, given Trump's support of Israel and the Israeli environment as well. And that, I think, will sort of take us down an interesting road. There's a tremendous amount of investment already, but a lot more to do in the cybersecurity domain. I think Trump, having had 8 years of experience, and there was a recent report of China hacking the AT&T and Verizon backdoor wiretapping capabilities to get access to Trump and other political leaders' cell phones, is making them more and more aware. And Trump's obviously had previous cyber attacks against his environment, his organization and environment. So I think the the cybersecurity investment will probably go up a little bit. We may see less investment in some of the other areas. Probably the only other interesting point from a true Trump perspective is what happens with Truth Social versus X, formerly Twitter, now that, as you said, Trump and Elon Musk are BFFs.
Yeah, that's a good question indeed. And I think that it's the areas that you mentioned are definitely things that we can infer again based on the people that are advising him, the people that are around him, what they're likely to be talking about. I think the Israeli connection is really interesting, as is his outspoken and aggressive support for the military in Israel. I think that that seems very likely that that would be a major focus for his administration. Another thing I want to bring up is another topic that we've had here on the rundown quite a lot, and that's the CHIPS Act. Now, this one is very, very fraught. So, if you remember, this was the US government investing big, big money to bring semiconductor production into the United States. A lot of this money has gone to Intel, but it's also gone to companies like TSMC and Samsung and others in the space. In fact, pretty much everybody has had their hands out for some of this CHIPS Act funding, and most companies have gotten some. One of the interesting aspects of the CHIPS Act, though, is that it is fairly short term as government programs go. And it's also one of those things where the administration has the ability to disrupt a lot of that funding. And many in the Trump administration have said things that make it sound like, or the would be Trump administration have said things that make it sound like they would derail the CHIPS Act. In fact, we've seen some of the folks, like, if I remember correctly, J.D. Vance saying that CHIPS Act is not something that they would support, that they don't consider increasing that funding. But at the same time, it's been interesting to see the pushback on that, especially considering that it would impact a huge amount of blue collar jobs, which are sort of Trump's core constituency, as well as a lot of red states where these investments are being made. And so I would not be surprised at all if basically the naysayers on the CHIPS Act have their way and Trump comes out opposed to it. I also wouldn't be surprised if he decides that he wants to continue it as a way to shore up his base of voters. So I think it's probably too soon to guess what's going to come with the CHIPS Act. Another aspect as well that, Jack, you and I have talked about is communications and telecom. Elon Musk, of course, is big in electric vehicles, which is something that Trump has, I guess, warmed to, but certainly has not been something that he's supportive of, uh, especially not electric boats and sharks. But he also, of course, has a big investment in space, and Trump loves big, important, impressive demonstrations of technology. He reportedly was highly, highly praising Elon Musk's recent success at SpaceX with the Starship booster catch. And I think that it is extremely likely that Trump's administration would direct the FAA and NASA to clear the decks and allow SpaceX to do whatever it wants with Starship. So that's going to be interesting. I wonder what that means for the SLS rocket. If you're into space stuff, that's sort of a cow, a sacred cow that no one can touch because it's built in like 40 different states and it costs way too much. And, I think everybody who looks at it objectively says that it should be canceled. If Elon Musk is alleged, as he's alleged to be, responsible for cleaning up government waste and inefficiency, I would say the SLS might be at the top of his list to cut. So we'll see about that. And then the other aspect, as you brought up, Jack, earlier, is the SpaceX's other product, which is their satellite communication network. Now, this has been pretty controversial. They have tried to get that access to or get that into broadband funding support and so on. So far, that's been unsuccessful, but we'll see long term, or now that there's a new administration, whether perhaps policies toward StarLink change as well. I guess we've brought up a ton of different things here. Any more that you want to suggest, Jack?
I think that's. I mean, there's so much that we can speculate about, but I think from a what are sort of, the technology hot buttons and the Trump hot buttons. Those are really it. I think that there's been a perception that Elon Musk has been handed some losses from the current administration. In that, as you mentioned, that Starlink, his communication satellite communication system, was originally involved in the rural broadband program and then was kicked out because they thought it wouldn't deliver, and yet it was the only thing that delivered. In my home state in Western North Carolina when it got hit by Hurricane Helene. So I think that there's a good possibility, given again, their buddies, that some of those sort of regulatory red tape that exists today will maybe disappear. My hope, and I think that the SLS should disappear. As you mentioned, it's a sacred cow, which also makes for a very tasty hamburger when you get rid of it, when you cook it down to what it really should be. But given how many different states are involved in that and how many different constituencies, that one's really going to be hard to tackle from a regulation, from a get political support to get rid of it type of concern.